Awkward silence. Do I start now? Yeah? Okay, let's do this. Last session of the day. Everyone wants to go home or whatever, not fall asleep. So, hi, my name's John. I'm going to be talking about .NET Core today and tomorrow. I have been at Microsoft 10 years now. They haven't fired me yet. I've bounced around a bunch of different things that are mostly .NET related. So I'm currently on the Visual Studio for Mac team, and we're focusing really heavily on .NET Core, making Visual Studio for Mac and Mac itself a really good .NET developer experience. Excuse me, experience. So if you're like, John Galloway, I don't know, here's some things you may remember me from. If you learned MVC, you may have done this MVC Music Store, and I wrote that. I've written a few books. Where is it? There it is. I wrote MVC 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I said, that's enough books. I started trying to work on the ASP.NET Core books, and they kept updating things all the time, and we were like, this is crazy. So I've been on this Hurting Code podcast for a while. I always have people tell me that they have watched Microsoft Virtual Academies. Those were really fun. Kind of sad they're not doing them anymore, but I did those. And then lately, one of the things I've been working on is this community stand-up. So we have these community stand-up shows every Tuesday and Thursday. I know they're probably at a not great time for you, but does anyone watch that? Thank you, thank you. Yeah, we have a lot of fun with these. We take live questions and answers, and then all the shows are up on YouTube also. So let's get into this. Here's what we're going to talk about: is what's current release. Some of the top features. Well, first of all, we'll talk about the history and where we're at. Then we'll talk about current top features. Then we will go into what's coming next, and then we'll try and look at how does it all make sense for what you do today. I think one problem we have at Microsoft is we just always talk about, here's the new thing we just shipped. And you're not always on the newest thing that we just shipped. And so we need to sometimes, I think, help you to figure out how do I get from here to there. When we talk about .NET, we think of it as, whoa, not that. I tried to hit forward. There it is. Are we going forward? I guess not. That's the end. There it is. We think of .NET as a platform for building anything. I think this is really cool. I mostly build ASP.NET Core apps, but when my daughter said, I want to build a game, I popped open Unity, and it worked, right? I've pair programmed on some Xamarin apps lately, and they worked. I actually started building desktop apps, and it was great that I could take my .NET skills from desktop to web, et cetera. So I think that is a really cool feature, and that's kind of a neat selling point of being a .NET developer. We are seeing, wow, so this, I'm like doing some double clicks, which maybe is telling me it's time to skip the slide. There it is. .NET is a cool place to be. We've been around for a while, but it's a very quickly growing ecosystem. I think sometimes because we've been around for a while, some people think, they think of .NET as that thing they looked at 5 or 10 years ago. You're in this room, so I think it's good that you're up to date. You've been seeing a lot of up-to-date presentations. Help us spread the word. Tell people that .NET Core is a thing. One thing that I think is really neat is this 7 times faster than Node.js. And that's been a really cool part of the .NET Core journey. When we first started, we were originally, we had .NET Framework, and we were really slow. There's this Tech Empower benchmarks, and it's a publicly run thing. The community runs it, and they have, I think, I don't know, easily over 100 benchmarks. And when we first started looking at these, we were way down near the bottom. We were way slower than the Node, than pretty much anything. And we said, why is that? We're compiled language. We have, there's no real good reason why we're not faster. And so we actually have boards up in the ASP.NET Developer Office that shows red and green, and it shows the numbers. And they track every day if changes they've made are slowing down or speeding up the system. So when you look currently at this, we are, I know it's small type, but we're number 10 on this list. If you search for Node, it's 87 and under a million requests per second, which is still really fast. But we're basically maxing out the network stack. We're tied for first with a bunch of other frameworks that are written in like Rust and C++ and stuff. So I think this is a cool place to be. We watch this. These benchmarks are published. They also have a nightly build, and so as I go out and look, we can see we're now at number 7 on the latest nightly ones. So we do keep a close eye on these. So anyhow, that's, I think, a pretty neat thing. Let's go back into this. Cool. So let's talk about the .NET release history. The first 1.0 release was in 2016. Who here used .NET Core 1.0 or earlier? OK, I'm sorry. It was, we were figuring it out. Then we have had some pretty steady progress since then. You'll see kind of moving along through these releases. Now, I think at Microsoft, we throw a lot at you, and we don't really give you a good way to keep it all in your head. I try to actually put things together as a my own kind of version that I use to kind of make it all make sense, right? So when I look at this, I think of the .NET Core 1.0 release was ship it, right? We had to get something out there. And we really were in a place where we needed people to use it so we could see what was working for them, which APIs they were missing, et cetera. So this was the .NET Core 1.0 release. The next release was the bug fix. It's the 1.1. Everyone has a 1.1 release where it's like, OK, yeah, well, sorry. Then .NET Core 2.0 was when we really made some kind of bigger changes after seeing what was working for people with 1.0 and 1.1. When companies started using it, they said, OK, I see what you're doing with this core thing. You took this big 10 years of .NET framework history, and you took out features and things that we didn't need passport authentication and all these kind of obsolete things. But you took out too much. And we can't use it yet because we actually use Active Directory, or we actually use some of these other features, right? So with .NET Core 2.0, we added back, I think it was about 25,000 APIs. We also, this was when .NET Standard came out, and this allowed you to share code between .NET Framework and all the different, .NET Core and all the other Xamarin and other .NET things, right? .NET Core 2.1 I think of as the fast release. I showed you the Tech Empower benchmarks, and the way we got from slow to fast was by writing our own custom web server, seeing what worked and didn't work, and optimizing the heck out of it. One thing that you'll see when you're trying to write high-performance code in .NET is you don't want the garbage collector to kick in. You don't want to allocate memory, because every time that garbage collector kicks in, it stops things, right? And those things, depending how much and how frequently that runs, it can have a major impact. So we actually were doing things to allocate memory and access and read and write strings out of blocks of memory without allocating new strings. And if you think about it, a web server is just a string processor. It gets requests coming in as strings, and then it does a bunch of stuff, and then it spits out a bunch of HTML and JavaScript and stuff as strings, right? So you really do have the possibility of allocating a ton of memory. So anyway, they went through and figured out how they basically managed their own memory. And as a result of that, they came up with some things that worked really well but were really tough to use. I tried poking around and thinking, hey, I'll make some pull requests to Kestrel, and it was like the code was really confusing. So as a result of that, they stepped back and they said, let's create some primitives that we can use all throughout .NET and that actually simplify our code quite a bit. So that's where we got things like span of t and memory management without allocating more memory. Once they did that, in 2.1, we actually pulled that back into .NET Framework. So things like our string, just the string class, now use that span of t and et cetera. So you'll see all throughout .NET Framework, we continue to speed it up by using things that we learned. All right. After that, we got to 2018. It's kind of flickering on. This is a microservices kind of focus. This is where we started paying more attention to microservices, and we started really there with a REST, looking at the REST stack. .NET Core 3.0, which came out in September, had kind of three things. The main thing is looking at desktop apps. We saw things that people were running into as they were they had existing desktop apps, and they were saying, how can we take advantage of what you're building with .NET Core? A couple of other things, too, is continuing to make things fast. There's some huge speed improvements there. And then also deeper microservices investment, and this was especially looking at things like gRPC. And then finally, .NET Core 3.1 is LTS. This is long-term support. And the idea here is that we support this for 3 years. As people are trying to take investments and understand, as you're trying to make your plans, you need to know how long things are going to be around. And so this is an LTS release. All right, so let's take a look at some things that are new. These are some of the top things in .NET Core 3.1. So the 3.1 thing specific really is that LTS release. Then we'll dig into some more of this stuff here. WPF, WinForm support, side-by-side and self-contained exes. And then some other fun stuff, Blazor and C#8 features. So first, let's look at some C#8 features. I have, from time to time, I get to talk to people on the C# team, and I'll say, hey, I think you should do this feature or that feature. And they remind me that once they ship a feature, it's out there. They can't take it back. It's really hard to change the language. And so when they do make a change, when they do ship a new release of the language, it's got a decent amount of stuff in it. C#8 has a lot in there. One thing here is C#8 nullable reference types. And null reference exceptions is one of the biggest causes of catastrophic, unhandled exceptions in your code. So what we've done here is we've made it easy to turn on null reference checking as part of the compile process. So really, you can turn this on in any application by editing the project file. You switch your language version to C#8, and then you say nullable enable. And we also have some other things where you can use pragma to just do a specific line of code. So you can go in right above something and say nullable enable, and then you say nullable, I forget what, it's another thing that you say basically resume or reset or whatever it is. So that allows you then to turn on this nullable reference checking. So let's take a look at that. I have, let me see. Here we go. I have a sample application, and all these links are going to be in the at the end. This actually goes to something that's in the docs, and no. So we want to open a different one. Recent solutions, yeah, simple feed reader. Yes, it's not because that blasted this thing. There, okay. Presenter mode, the bane of speakers around the world. Okay, so here we've turned on nullable reference checking, and we've done that because in this application, this is a simple feed reader, and we've made some mistakes that aren't quite obvious. So if I go through and build, and I've done, There, let's go build. And when we do this, because of turning on Nullable, if I had first built this without, I would see no build errors. So I should, this is the completed one. Okay. So there's a before and after in this solution, and I opened the after. Okay, projects, simple feed reader. There. Let's try one more time here. And now it's hung. All right. Okay. Hopefully this is it. Okay. So in this one, let's see if this is the right one. Build. What I should see is that it's going to go through, when it builds the application, it's going to flag some warnings. And I could actually set warnings as errors. And in this case, let's see if this is the complete. Oh, this is the completed. Try one more time. So there's two that are named the same thing. So this is finished. This is start. There it is. Okay. So we've got Nullable enabled. We have a class here. We've got a view model. And we've got some things here where, for instance, we've got strings and URIs. And these are, it says non-nullable, so it's a little bit small, but it says non-nullable property is uninitialized. So consider declaring as nullable. And I can do that by saying, oops, after the string. Right? But then it's going to give me other errors. And this is helpful because it's going to help me go through and understand what I should do with my application. So in the example that we walked you through, it actually shows you how to do, in this case, it has you rewrite things using a constructor, right? So my constructor, I'm using my constructor to set, and then in those individual properties, I'm no longer having a setter in the properties, I just have a getter, right? So this is an example where, number one, turning these on will help you find null reference exceptions, but it also can cause a lot of errors, and so you may want to use those pragma directives just before and after specific lines of code. We've actually been going through and turning these on in the core FX, and it's something where we're having to be slow and deliberate about it because it does give you a lot of errors all at once. All right. So another neat thing is pattern matching. So I've just got some examples here. So here we've got a switch statement where we're switching based on a lot of different colors. And then case of this, return this, case of this, return this. And we can simplify this quite a bit by bringing in pattern matching here. So for instance, here we're able to do a much cleaner switch statement. Here's a few other examples. Here's a switch statement where we're switching on a property of the location. And based on that, we're setting a sales price. And then one other fun one is switching on a tuple, and based on the tuple settings, it's returning a response. So this does give you the opportunity to simplify your switch statements quite a bit. And there's a lot of other things that it can do. So those are just a few things I picked out. There's a ton of different ones. So this AKMS new C# points you to the docs, and it walks you through a lot of these different examples. All right, let's dig into desktop apps. So who here is building or maintaining desktop apps? All right. So some things we're seeing is that when we talk to companies that are maintaining desktop apps, they say, hey, it's really difficult for us to update. For instance, if we want to update .NET Framework on a machine, we run into problems because it may break other applications installed on the machine, right? And so one major difference between .NET Framework and .NET Core is the ability to do self-contained deployments. So each application can include its own version of .NET. So .NET Framework, when I install the newest version, it may break others on the box. We also, and so all these things about deploying, with different versions is a real pain point. We've talked to some companies that have thousands of desktop applications. So handling those different framework versions is a difficulty. So additionally, one other thing is I've been talking about all those performance improvements. And when we talk to people, they say, that's great. I would love that, better memory management, faster strings, et cetera. How can I get that in my desktop apps? So let me show you a few quick things we're doing with Windows Forms. Now, as part of this, I'm switching over to a VM. And I'm doing that because Windows Forms and WPF are Windows specific. So what we're allowing you to do is update your Windows Forms and WPF applications running on Windows to take advantage of .NET Core 3. However, we're not making them cross-platform. Okay? So it's basically a brain transplant to upgrade your Windows Forms and WPF apps. So two quick things. One is if I've got a folder here, WinForms and WPF. So we'll go. Thank you. Okay. So there we go. I've got a Windows Forms and a WPF folder, so I'll go cd WinForms and .NET new WinForms. So the idea here is that the whole kind of tool chain, including command line build, all that instrumentation, also, if you look at, if I do, here's the CS proj file. So it's just a few lines, right? So I could build and edit this directly in like VS Code. And so that's the idea, is it greatly simplifies and allows you to use all the .NET Core features with WinForms and WPF. Now, one other neat thing, I mentioned self-contained deployments. And so here I've got that Windows Forms application. And I can also, as I publish this, number one, I can publish to a specific folder. But I can also, in here, I can say self-contained. And then I can turn on some other file publish options. So here I'm saying publish single file and also trim unused assemblies. And that's in preview. This takes, it takes a little bit of time to run. But when I did this, it's somewhere, whoa. OK, but that's not what I want to do. So when I did this, it was a single file that was about 80 megabytes. And we can probably get this smaller over time. If we dig around in here, I'm not going to take time because we don't have a lot of it. But it published down to a single exe. The thing with that is, it is a single exe. It is processor specific. But within an office, I could deploy that on a USB stick or however. It's just a single exe, right? So that's neat. Let's go back. All right, so that's WinForms. All right. Hello? Yes, awesome. Let's keep going. All right, so we looked at building WinForms WPF apps and publishing them. Another thing is microservices. I'm going to rip through this pretty fast because you've seen some microservices stuff today. Some of the things we focused on with .NET Core 3. Am I talking too fast? Is this cool? All right. So some of the things we focused on recently is like gRPC, worker services, and authenticated APIs. So some advantages of gRPC. It is built on top of modern technology. So if you look at traditional REST services, they're built on HTTP. They're strings. They're not taking advantage of the newest stuff. So gRPC is a modern remote procedure call framework built on top of HTTP and protobuf. So some things that gives you is OK, so first of all, protobuf it's an IDL. It's a different syntax, but it's relatively easy to understand and write. It is a service model, and it's a wire format. So if you actually look at this going over the wire, you're going to see just binary data. So some things comparing between gRPC and REST. It is binary. It's high performance. It does focus on developer productivity because you're defining your IDL. And then REST is kind of, works anywhere HTTP works, and it's human readable. And so, gRPC is going to give you that fast performance. Yep, so there you go. I'm going to go kind of quick, but there's a graph that shows clearly it's faster. And so here's an example showing moving from HTTP 1.1 to HTTP 2, and just showing that by multiplexing, you can get much faster performance. And finally, with code generation, the idea here is because you've got this IDL, with .NET, we actually generate classes for you, a client class. So by defining the gRPC tools, then that generates a class for you. So you're actually able to call this virtual class, and it will make the calls for you. So for instance, here, let me see. It's a simple client class, and it's generated and it's kept up to date on build. So it's like a virtual class that's built for you. And then by moving to gRPC, this works across a lot of different existing services and a lot of different languages. So it's pretty well adopted in industry. I'm going quickly. Yeah. So some disadvantages are you don't have direct support in browsers, and you do end up using like gRPC web. So that is something that we are working on, the support for gRPC web, for instance, in ASP.NET Core. Also, another thing you'll run into is gRPC requires HTTP 2, and so that doesn't directly work on IIS or app service. So you end up then needing you need to think about it more as you deploy it. All right, we'll go faster. OK, skipping. Yes, it's binary data. OK, cool. ASP.NET Core 3, one of the things we added in here was support for SPA authentication. So let's take a look real quick at how that works with identity. So if I'm in So I have an Angular application. I just did file new project, and then as I created an Angular app, I said include individual auth. So the thing I want to point out with this is there's actually a decent amount of code here that's created for you. So we've got, for instance, I have an API authorization folder that includes login and logout. I also have in my APIs, there's controllers for like OIDC configuration. And then also in my startup class, there's some things in here where it's configuring, and this is actually working with Identity Server to handle that. So a few things is, one, this is creating code for you that's maintained and updated by the ASP.NET team. Another thing is it's gone through all those security reviews by people that actually understand things like OIDC, which is not me. And so I don't want to write that code. I want someone else that stays up late at night thinking about those things. So So there's that. Okie doke. So, web apps with Blazor. Part of why I was talking fast is I wanted to talk about Blazor. And I know you have seen some Blazor stuff already, so I'll go quickly through that. But the idea with Blazor is previously building applications with ASP.NET Core, you would have .NET Core running on the server as you're writing, serving HTTP and also API calls. And then in the client, you would have your front end that's a JavaScript client and is making those calls back and forth. Can I get a show of hands? How many people are building applications using this today? Angular, React, Vue, et cetera. It's more than that. When I asked yesterday, I talked about ASP.NET, and like almost every hand went up. So it is. I think some of you, it's just end of the day, and you don't want to raise your hand. But so number one, those are all great libraries. It works really well for a lot of people. However, it may not be the most productive for you or your dev team. I know when I'm writing JavaScript, I'm not quite as productive as I am writing C#, and that's partly because I also have to think about things like bundling, minification. I have to go look at docs for Webpack. I have to. I don't have all my NuGet libraries that I'm used to using. I also have to keep things in sync. For instance, if I have a model class on the server, then I need to also write a JavaScript or TypeScript class on the client, and I need to keep those up to date. So it's not the most productive sometimes. So if you are a dev shop that is super good at Angular, React, Vue, et cetera, that's great. Keep using them. If you are a dev shop that is mostly C# and every now and then you need to do some front-end dev, then I think Blazor is a pretty nice fit. So the idea, this is the official marketing stuff where they say, build front end with .NET instead of JavaScript. But then as you read through, it also says call into JavaScript libraries and browser APIs as needed. And I think that's really a better way of talking about this. So I like to say it's .NET and JavaScript. You get all the best of JavaScript, and you also can use .NET. And what's great about it is it's built using WebAssembly, which is a browser standard. So it's going to work just based on already accepted browser standards. So the idea is that you've got WebAssembly, which is browser standard. Then we have .NET running on top of that. And then we have a component system to write your components. And these can be as simple as included things like a button, or you can build a rich, like a grid or a chart or whatever. And then you've got, it's keeping track of updating the DOM. Now, when we ship that, well, first of all, we haven't shipped that. That's still in preview. That's expected out in May at the build timeframe. And part of the reason is because WebAssembly is new, this component model is new, there's a lot of things that are new with this, including our compiling. We're trying to get things as small as possible. And we've made some huge progress on that. I think applications now are in the few megabyte range, which kind of compares to a lot of JavaScript libraries. But as we were building that, the component model really worked pretty well for a lot of people. And so they said, hey, can we start using this today? And we said, you know what? We have .NET on the server nailed. We've been doing this for years. We're really good at it. We also have the SignalR thing, which is real-time communication client and server. And so we've hooked that up, and that actually shipped with .NET Core 3. So that's available now. One really nice thing is, first of all, if you ship something using WebAssembly, Blazor WebAssembly, we don't know, and you're fine to do that, but it's not official, right? It's not supported. But Blazor Server is, and it's only a few lines of code to change between Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. So what we've been telling people to do is, you can ship applications now using Blazor Server, and when Blazor WebAssembly ships, you can flip those few lines of code. We've also seen people are actually detecting different levels of support or just having switches in the code to switch between. So that's the idea there. When I first saw Blazor WebAssembly, I said, yeah, this totally makes sense. It's a VM running in the browser, and .NET is pretty cool, and let's make them run together. Blazor server, at first I thought, why are we doing this? But then after looking at it, there are some really compelling things. Number one is the Blazor component model is really nice. And for some developers, for a lot of developers, moving from like web forms to MVC is not a great fit. It's not the simplest, it's not the most productive model. There are some things, I'll be honest, where people have said, hey, show me how to do master details in MVC. And I said, well, you have to do a composite view model and blah, blah. And they started crying. It's not super easy, right? Whereas doing components with Blazor, it actually does work pretty smoothly. Also, this has been really cool to see the vendors jump in. So we've got vendors out there that have, like Progress, Telerik, Syncfusion, et cetera, that have been building rich grids and charts and reporting for years, and that didn't really apply that great to something like MVC. However, it does with something like Blazor because it's a component. So one other neat thing is, if you're using Blazor server, it doesn't need to download very much at all to the client. It downloads a very lightweight DOM, and then it calls back to the server, so you're downloading less so it's a very tiny, it's just a few hundred K in order to bootstrap the application. So that's also a nice consideration. Mentioned in the previous session, the Blazing Pizza is a pretty fun workshop where you can build Brit pizzas with crumpets on them. We also recently had a Focus on Blazor event, so this is just from a month ago, and so this is also a great place to find out what's up to date with Blazor. And here's some more links. Again, all these slides, I'll have a link to download the slides at the end. So Blazor.net is kind of the place. I'm going to skip the Blazor demo. We just saw stuff in the previous session. I want to spend some time talking about a few really cool Blazor experiments. And these are totally experiments. However, Blazor was an experiment when we first started with it. So if you like these, let people know at Microsoft. Okay, there we go. So this is actually a Blazor application running as a desktop app. So you can check out the code for this. This is using Web Window, which is actually, it is an abstraction around the built-in browser support that comes in desktop apps, or any desktop OS. So Windows, Mac, Linux all include a built-in browser. So if you think about an application structure like Electron, Electron is actually pretty complicated. It ships Node and Chromium, and then it has a bunch of hacks that say, well, when you do this, you're actually calling directly, you're running on a desktop, and it's tricking the node into thinking it's a server, but not really. It's really very, there's a lot going on, and the applications are kind of large. By doing this with Blazor, we actually, we don't need a browser, because we're using the web window that's built into the OS. We also don't need a server. We're just running that WebAssembly code directly. So comparing the file size, we're actually seeing tiny, like less than a megabyte for these web window applications. So I cloned the repo and ran it. Like, it's not a weird hack to set up. This is a really pretty interesting experiment. And so this is Blazor code running on a desktop. There's an example, which I don't have time to show, but it's pretty neat, where it's actually reading from the file system, and it's a file browser. So that's a pretty cool, that is experiment number 1. I think it's pretty neat. Who here thinks that's neat? Pretty neat? Okay, cool. I say ship it. The next thing I want to show is mobile Blazor bindings. So the idea here is, it's Xamarin Forms using Blazor syntax. So there are a lot of developers out there that love XAML, and they totally think in XML, and that's great. I'm actually more of a web dev, and I like CSS, and I like HTML, and that's more natural to me. So as a web dev, if I wanted to build mobile applications, this looks pretty neat. Now, I'm still using things like a stack layout and a button. So those are primitives from Xamarin Forms. But I'm writing my code using the Blazor component model. So this here is all you would need to have a button that clicks through different times. So this is the link for this mobile Blazor bindings. We've had a few updates to this. We have some pretty cool contributions from the community coming in. So if you're interested in this, let us know also. And so a few other neat things. There's machine learning. So ML.NET. And the idea with ML.NET really is if you are a .NET developer and you would like to use machine learning in your applications, right now, well, until ML.NET, the answer was go learn another language. Go learn Python and go do some other stuff. And if you are really going to be a data scientist and really get into machine learning, that's probably the right thing to do. But if you're a .NET developer and you would just like to do something like sentiment analysis or product recommendations, forecasting, image classification, these are all things where you don't actually need to write a whole bunch of custom code. Instead, you can use ML.NET, which will handle that for you. So here is my easiest demo because it's a video. This is showing in Visual Studio on Windows, we have support for generating a machine learning model. So here we point it at a CSV file. We tell it to go train itself. It tries a bunch of different algorithms. And already when I say algorithms, I'm like out of my depth. Like this, it's doing some magical things. And then when it's done, it actually generates some code for me. So this code includes, there's that mlmodel.zip, and that's the actual model. And so right there, I can ship this. And so we have some examples, for instance, using Blazor applications that are using ML.NET and a machine learning model and doing things like image classification or sentiment analysis. So it's really easy to drop these into your existing .NET applications and get started with machine learning. There's also some stuff we've done with IoT, support for Raspberry Pi, and also shrinking applications down. That's all I'm going to talk about, because we're going to go on to .NET 5. So all the stuff that I've talked about so far has shipped. .NET 5 is what's coming out in November. And the real goal that we're trying to solve here with in 2014, we had mini .NETs. We had .NET Framework, we had .NET Core, and then we also had Mono and Xamarin, which are all .NET. They're all C#, but they're different runtimes underneath. So the first big step was creating .NET Standard, and this was in 2016. And this allows you to share NuGet packages and library code between the different .NETs. But they're still separate .NETs. And the next step is .NET 5, where we actually compress that down. So this is taking some of the best of all of them. So taking the best of, for instance, Mono and Xamarin have great support for AOT compilation, whereas .NET Core is focused on JIT compilation. So this is allowing you to use both of those within .NET Core. So .NET 5, you're able to toggle and use either of those. Now, pretty soon, I'm going to just be kind of waving my hands and mumbling, because we haven't really announced anything, and we're not going to until build. And internally at Microsoft, they're like, hey, maybe we could do this or that, but they're still figuring it out, honestly. We're in the arguing stage where we're sitting around in conference rooms yelling at each other, and we haven't decided exactly what's going to be in .NET 5. So we have decided, support basically the best of everything. Also, interop with Java and Swift, which is pretty interesting. This is two-way interop with Java and Swift. That was announced in the original, .NET 5 blog, which I've linked there. we're still open to suggestions. So here are a few tweets from Rich Lander on the .NET team where he's asking for input. And they're still at this stage asking for input. And that's part of why I was saying with those Blazor experiments, could they get in .NET 5 or .NET 6 or whatever? Probably, if there's enough interest, right? So this is the time where if there are things that are interesting to you or you would like change, now is a great time to make suggestions. Things that are not in .NET 5 are web forms, WPF server, and workflow. And so let's talk about that. What to do today. And so for new development, I would recommend .NET Core 3.1. That's the long-term support release that's supported for 3 years. And so I would jump into that right now. I would also, as you're developing things, for new applications, I would start with nullable types right away. It's a lot easier to build with nullable types at the beginning than to null reference types than it is to go and fix it later. For Windows Forms and WPF applications, I would recommend updating to .NET Core 3 and also take advantage of single file publishing. It makes it a lot easier to handle like say, for instance, deployment within an organization and not worry about the different versions interfering with each other. You can take advantage of all those C#8 features as well. For web forms, I would look at Blazor. And there's actually, I don't know if any of you follow Jeff Fritz. He's been doing some work with Blazor to actually port web forms controls to Blazor. So, and he's made some pretty good progress with that. They're both built using a component model, so it's an easier thing to port to than something like MVC. And for WCF, .NET Framework is still supported, so you can stay with .NET Framework. It's supported as long as the operating system is supported, so it's considered an operating system component. So in a lot of cases, your best bet is to just stay with .NET Framework. Or you can look at rewriting to either gRPC or something like Core WCF. So, but in a lot of cases, when I talk to developers and they say, I've got 400 WCF services, usually the best bet is probably leave those on .NET Framework and maybe long-term consider writing newer services with gRPC, but I don't know if I would necessarily start rewriting right off the bat. So, and then some kind of general things, you know, remember .NET Framework is still supported. There are some pretty good migration guides for different things as you're looking at moving forward. For instance, gRPC, we've written some big ebooks. Stay tuned for Build for our big announcements, and now is the time for feedback. So here's a fancy marketing slide that I think I get paid to put in or something. Here's our release schedule. So 3.1 has just shipped. We've got .NET 5 coming out in November, and then we've announced that this is our next release strategy going forward. So we're copying what's worked for a lot of other big projects, like, for instance, Node and Ubuntu, where we say, hey, this is our schedule, and the features are going to match up to what we can ship in this schedule. So you'll notice every other year is an LTS release. So we had our LTS release was 3.1. Then .NET 5 is going to be an update, but it's not an LTS release. So what that means is, if you want to stay on an LTS release, you can develop against .NET 5, but you'll need to move to .NET Core or .NET 6 when it ships to continue to be on an LTS release. So, and I'm just about done here. I'm totally done. This is the fancy slide, so get .NET Core 3. And build all these cool apps. And then here is a link to the slides, and then I'll update it with a lot of the other links that I've mentioned through this. I think we're kind of at the time, but do we still take questions? Questions happening? Yes! Okay. gRPC does not work with IIS. Are there plans to make it work with IIS? Yes, but. So it's not as simple as you'd think. It requires updates to IIS, which includes updates to Windows. So it's some kind of major changes. Updating Windows Windows is supported for decades. Windows releases outlive us, and so it's a big deal. So yes, it will happen. We know people really want it. I want it, but it's in the works, but it'll take some time. So there are issues too. You can follow some issues on GitHub. All right, what are the limitations of Visual Studio for Mac compared with Windows version? They're a lot less now, honestly. So some things that have gotten better lately is really we focused on things like Blazor, ASP.NET Core support. So those are kind of the big things. A few areas where we obviously don't work with is things like Windows Forms and WPF, right? There are also some places with, there's live share, there's code lens, so some of those kind of more advanced features in the editor. However, the team has actually done some pretty amazing work. They've ported over the editor that was used in Visual Studio for Windows. It's the same code that runs on Visual Studio for Mac. So it's rendered using Cocoa in Visual Studio for Mac, but it's the same editor code. What that means is that was the big first step to allow turning on things like Code Lens and Live Share. So there's definitely, if you're using Visual Studio for Mac, well, we have a published roadmap. So you can just, Google Bing for Visual Studio Mac roadmap, and you'll see what we're working on. Cool. Sorry, I pretended like I was going to switch to my screen, but I'm not. Another question? I think we need to switch back to the other computer. Yes. OK, so are there plans of releasing WPF .NET Core alternative that will work on Mac and Linux? So we're figuring things out. This is definitely something that people have asked quite a bit about. I would look for us to talk in the build timeframe. I honestly don't know. I do know that currently Xamarin Forms is kind of emerging as a pretty standard. There are two things that are emerging as work on multiple platforms, right? There's Xamarin Forms, which has support for Android, iOS. You can run it on Windows desktop. You can run it on Mac already. So that's something we're looking at. And then there's also the Blazor desktop. And I showed you like the web view. And so that's something we're also looking at. Would it be in .NET 5? Not sure. But those are things, if I was going to place bets, I would be thinking about those. Definitely something I've wanted for a long time. This is something we got to do it right. So I've been impatient in the past, but once we ship it, we're stuck with it for a long time, and you're stuck with it for a long time. So we want to make sure it's right. But I would be pretty surprised if we don't hear something about that in the build timeframe. All right, I guess that's it. Thank you. Something else will happen now, and I'm not sure what. It's the end of the day. I'm hoping the disco lights come on when other people finish talking, the lights would go. Thank you.